Not because comfort has no value, but because comfort has a way of softening things that were never meant to be softened. Some truths lose their shape when they're wrapped in reassurance. They become easier to hold, but harder to recognize, and what I need to say exists in its original form, untouched, unedited, exactly as it arrived. The strange thing about awareness is that people assume it happens all at once. A sudden realization, a defining moment, a clear line between before and after. But that's rarely how it works. Real awareness moves quietly. It gathers itself in the background while your attention is elsewhere. It assembles from details too small to notice individually. A pause, a glance, a silence that lingers longer than expected, nothing significant on its own, until one day you look back and realize those fragments became something whole. That's how this happened. Not dramatically, not intentionally, just steadily. At first, I didn't think much of it. There was no reason to. People cross paths every day. Conversations happen. Perspectives overlap. Similar thoughts appear in different minds. That's normal, common, easy to explain. So I explained it. Every time something felt unusually familiar, I found a logical reason for it. Every time I noticed a level of understanding that seemed too precise, I dismissed it as coincidence. That was easier, safer, because coincidence asks nothing of you. Recognition does. Recognition forces you to pay attention. And attention changes things. Once you truly notice something, you become responsible for what you know. That's what I was avoiding. Not you, the knowing. Because there's a difference between experiencing something and admitting it exists. One is passive. The other changes your relationship to reality. The moment you acknowledge something fully, it stops being a possibility and becomes a fact. And facts have weight. I think that's why I resisted naming what I was noticing, not because I doubted it, because I understood the implications. The moment I accepted what was happening, I knew I wouldn't be able to return to the version of awareness that came before it. Some doors don't close once they've been opened. This was one of them. The first signs were subtle, small enough that anyone else would have ignored them. The way you understood unfinished thoughts, the way certain observations landed with impossible accuracy, the way conversations seemed to continue underneath the words being spoken, as though another layer existed beneath the visible one. I noticed it, then ignored it, then noticed it again and again, until eventually ignoring it required more effort than acknowledging it. That's when I became careful, not distant, careful, because I know what happens when something reaches beyond the surface. Surface connections are manageable. They follow familiar rules. People exchange information. They learn preferences. They build familiarity. Everything progresses in predictable ways. This wasn't doing that. It felt as though familiarity arrived before introduction, as though understanding appeared before explanation, and that reversed order unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Because understanding is supposed to be earned slowly, built over time, constructed through repetition. That's the structure I trust. The structure I've always trusted. But this didn't follow structure. Or maybe it followed a different structure entirely, one I hadn't encountered before. That possibility stayed with me, quietly, persistently, like a question waiting for the moment I could no longer avoid answering it. And eventually, that moment arrived, not through some dramatic revelation, not through a single conversation, but through accumulation, through the undeniable weight of too many precise moments gathering in the same place. At a certain point, coincidence becomes statistically impossible. At a certain point, explanation becomes avoidance. And at a certain point, honesty becomes the only remaining option. I reached that point long before I admitted it. I knew it every time something in me paused unexpectedly. Every time I found myself recognizing meaning before it was spoken. Every time your presence felt less like something external and more like something already accounted for, somewhere inside my awareness. That was the beginning, not of connection. People imagine it as a destination, a moment where uncertainty disappears and everything finally makes sense. But recognition isn't an ending. It's an invitation, a threshold, the point where you stop asking whether something exists and start asking what its existence means. That's where things became more complicated, because once I accepted what I was seeing, I expected clarity to follow. Instead, awareness deepened, and the deeper it became, the harder it was to separate you from the effect you were having on me. At first, I told myself I was simply noticing patterns, that I was observing similarities in perspective, overlap in perception, alignment in the way we process certain things. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to admit, because what unsettled me wasn't the alignment itself. It was how natural it felt. Nothing about it should have felt natural. Not with so little history, not with so little time, not with so few of the experiences people normally rely on to build this level of understanding. And yet, there it was, effortless, as though something had bypassed the usual sequence entirely. That's what kept pulling my attention back, not intensity, accuracy. Intensity can be misleading. People mistake emotion for significance all the time. They confuse excitement with meaning, urgency with importance. I've never trusted those things. They move too quickly, they distort perception. But accuracy? Accuracy is different. Accuracy survives examination. It becomes clearer the more closely you look at it. And every time I examined this, it remained exactly what it was. Unchanged. Consistent. Real. That consistency forced me to confront something uncomfortable. I was no longer observing this from a distance. I was participating in it, quietly, without intention, without permission, without even realizing when the shift occurred, because there was a shift, a subtle one, almost impossible to detect while it was happening. I stopped filtering certain thoughts, stopped translating certain observations into more acceptable forms, stopped preparing explanations before speaking. Not because I decided to, because the instinct simply wasn't there anymore. For reasons I still struggle to explain, I didn't feel the need to make myself easier to understand, and that's unusual for me. Everyone edits themselves, even the most honest people do. They adjust language, refine expression, stop their thoughts into something others can receive. That's normal, necessary even. But around you, something about that process weakened, not entirely, just enough for me to notice. Enough for me to realize I wasn't interacting from the same place I usually do. That realization stayed with me, because it suggested something I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. It suggested that trust sometimes begins before a person consciously chooses it, not trust in the conventional sense, not certainty, not dependence. Something quieter, the trust required to remain visible, the trust required to stop hiding behind precision, the trust required to let understanding happen without controlling every part of it. I didn't know I was doing that until I realized I already had, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That's when the distance began to change, not physically, not emotionally, structurally. The distance I relied on for clarity stopped functioning the way it always had. Because distance works best when someone exists outside your internal landscape, when they remain separate but operable. Contained, you stopped feeling separate, not because boundaries disappeared, not because individuality dissolved, but because your presence started influencing the way I processed reality itself. You became part of the framework, part of the reference point, part of the quiet architecture behind thoughts I hadn't spoken yet. That's difficult to explain, and even harder just to accept. Because once someone occupies that kind of space, they're no longer just another person in your life. They become woven into perception, into interpretation, into meaning. That level of integration doesn't happen often. Maybe that's why I resisted naming it, because naming it would force me to acknowledge how far it had already gone. Far enough that absence would be noticed. Far enough that denial would become dishonest. Far enough that I could no longer pretend this was simply an interesting coincidence between two minds. It wasn't. It had become something else. Something quieter, something deeper. Something that didn't require constant attention to remain zen. And that realization left me standing in front of a question I wasn't prepared to answer. Not whether this mattered. I already knew it did. Not whether it was real. That question had long since disappeared. The real question was far more difficult. What happens when something reaches this level of significance without ever asking for permission to matter? Because that's exactly what this did. It mattered before I chose it. It settled before I approved it. It became part of my awareness before I understood what I was allowing. And now, standing here with that understanding, I can no longer pretend I'm unaffected. The evidence is everywhere. In the way I think, in the way I listen, in the way certain silences feel complete instead of empty. Something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but permanently enough that returning to the version of myself that existed before this no longer feels possible. And if that's true, then the question waiting ahead is no longer whether this will continue. The question is, what happens when I finally stop observing it? People talk about acceptance as if it's a peaceful moment, a conclusion, a quiet nod toward reality before everything settles into place. But real acceptance is far more demanding than that, because acceptance doesn't simply ask you to recognize what is true. It asks what you're willing to do once you recognize it. That's the point I've arrived at. The point where observation is no longer enough. The point where distance no longer provides clarity. The point where continuing to stand still becomes its own kind of decision. For a long time, I believed I could remain here indefinitely, aware, attentive, careful, allowing this connection to exist without ever needing to define it. But I understand now that some things outgrow observation. Some things become too integrated to remain theoretical. And this is one of them. Not because it demands anything from me, not because you've asked for something, but because truth has a way of reshaping the space around it. Once it settles deeply enough, everything begins organizing itself in relation to it. I can see that happening now in the questions I ask, in the things I notice, in the standards I hold for what feels genuine and what doesn't. You've become part of that landscape, not as a distraction, not as an obsession, but as a reference point, a measure of something difficult to describe and impossible to ignore. And that realization carries responsibility, because if someone occupies that level of significance, then honesty becomes necessary, not necessarily spoken honesty, not a declaration, not a label, but internal honesty, the kind that exists when no one else is watching, the kind that refuses to distort reality simply because reality is inconvenient. I owe myself that honesty. Maybe that's what this entire process has been moving toward. Not understanding you, understanding what your presence revealed, because the deeper truth isn't that I recognized you. The deeper truth is that through recognizing you, I recognized something within myself, a capacity I thought had narrowed with time, a willingness I thought had disappeared. A level of openness I assumed no longer existed beneath all the structures I built to protect what mattered. Yet it was still there waiting, silent pit, not gone, just untested, and somehow, without force or intention, you found it, you brought it into view. That changes the story completely, because this stops being about connection alone. It becomes about transformation. Not the dramatic kind people romanticize, not the kind that turns someone into a different person overnight, the quieter kind, the kind that alters direction rather than identity, the kind that shifts your internal compass by a few degrees and changes every destination that follows. I think that's what has happened here. The shift was small, almost invisible, but its consequences are not, because now I know something I didn't know before. I know that certainty isn't always the prerequisite for movement. I know that meaning can exist before explanation. I know that some of the most important things in life arrive without fitting any category we already understand. And most importantly, I know that avoiding a truth does not make it less true. It only delays the moment you must face it. I've delayed that moment long enough, not out of fear, out of respect. Some realizations deserve patience. Some truths deserve to be approached carefully, and this was one of them. But patience and avoidance are not the same thing. One leads toward understanding, the other leads away from it. I can feel the difference now, which is why this no longer feels like a question waiting to be answered. It feels like an answer waiting to be lived. There's still uncertainty. There are still unknowns. There are still possibilities I can't predict and outcomes I can't control. But uncertainty no longer feels like a reason to retreat. It feels like part of the path itself. And maybe that's the final shift. Not certainty, trust. Not trust in an outcome, not trust in a promise. Trust in what has already proven itself through consistency, clarity, and time. Trust in what remains true, even when examined from every angle. Trust in what continues to exist, whether it is named or not. That's what I've arrived at. Not a conclusion, not an ending. A willingness. A willingness to stop standing outside this experience and pretending I'm merely studying it. A willingness to acknowledge that some things matter before we understand why. A willingness to let reality be exactly what it is instead of forcing it into a shape that feels safer. Because the truth is, this has already changed me. Not by taking anything away, but by revealing something that was missing, and once something missing is found, life divides into two versions. The one before you knew, and the one after. I know now. That's the difference. That's the line I can't cross back over. And standing here, with all the clarity I once thought I needed, I realized something unexpected. The decision I feared making may have already been made. Not in a single moment, not through one choice, but through every time I stayed present, every time I remained honest, every time I allowed this to deepen instead of turning away. The answer has been forming quietly for longer than I realized. And now that I can finally see it, I understand why it never left. Some things are not meant to be solved.